I should get going then. So we didn't have a proper symposium event last year, but Sitecore did make a load of kind of product-related announcements at the little collection of conferences they did in Minneapolis at the back end of last year. And if you paid attention to any of the kind of press releasey stuff that they did around that, you might have seen them starting to talk about this Accelerate thing. So I will take the next 20 minutes or so and try and explain a bit about what that is and why you think Sitecore think it's necessary and where it might be going. For those of you probably out on the internet who've not met me before, my name is Jeremy. I'm part of the solution architecture team here at UNRVLD. At this point, I fear I'm also slightly part of the furniture in the Sitecore community, having made it to 10 years as an MVP this year. But, kind of relatedly to that, I was lucky enough to be in Minneapolis for Sitecore's various events last year, and to hear about this Accelerate business from some of the people who are actually organising it. So I get to play that back for you all. I've tried to split this talk up into 4 kind of main chunks of content. There's a bit about what Accelerate is and what it isn't as well. I've got a few thoughts on where Sitecore are going with this down the road and what they hope to achieve with the program. And since I think this is probably going to be a bit of a long-term thing for Sitecore, some info on what's there now and what we might see in the future. And I'll round off with a few brief conclusions and take any questions at the end if anyone's got any. So, first up then, what is Accelerate? The first thing to say here, I think, is that it is not a product. There's no actual new technology going on here. Fundamentally, this is a quality program. What we're seeing here is kind of the early days of Sitecore's trying to ensure that as we move towards composable and XM Cloud and so on, the projects that get delivered are fairly decent and make Sitecore's clients happy. They see that as a win-win, basically. You know, it's good for them, it's good for their brand, it's good for us as partners and consultants and developers, and it's good for the people who are actually buying the product. And for a variety of reasons, they do not see let's just rebrand Helix for Headless as a good approach here. And yeah, that's not entirely surprising, to be honest. So they've sat down and they've tried to work out what a good XM Cloud project should look like. They've based this on experience and knowledge largely from their own staff at this point. You know, they've got all the people who actually designed and built this stuff, so in theory they know how it should be used. And their partner technology advisory team, or whatever they're calling themselves at the moment, has been working with some clients and partners on the Pathfinder projects for XM Cloud for a while now as well. At the end of last year, Sitecore was saying they expected to have about 100 projects in the wild at this point. And if they hit their targets, maybe that hitting about 500 by the end of this year. So potentially quite a lot of experience, even though I don't think any of us have got particularly close to this yet. Plus, the PTA team have been dealing with projects in JSS for a while, so they've generally got some background in Headless, separate to the XM Cloud bits. So as a business, they've built up some knowledge on what works, what goes smoothly, and what doesn't, basically. They've tried to look at both software patterns and the kind of project organization stuff as well here. They want to try and provide helpful information for all the stages of a development project, basically, from the planning and the setup through to implementation, test, and potentially delivery as well. And they are also working on an assessment framework. They kind of want to be able to check up on us, basically, and make sure that the projects that are getting delivered do actually match up to the standards they're trying to put down. somewhere in their documentation, they basically said that there are kind of 4 points in the background for this, that they want to use this to understand customer needs, to build business cases, plan implementations, and actually deliver stuff that works in the long term. Some of that stuff is on them and their kind of pre-sales consultancy people and their internal technical teams, but a lot of that is going to be on us as partners and developers. So this doesn't really sound like what they've had as developer advice in the past. So what has caused them to move away from the old patterns and try a new approach here? Well, let's be honest, I'm fairly certain that all of us have inherited some fairly crappy projects at some point in our development careers. One of those N-tier is all I know projects where literally every class has a hard dependency on every other one, or the modern classic of I misunderstood Helix and every single file is a separate Visual Studio project. Either way, sucks to be us some of the time. And importantly, those projects tend to suck for the people buying Sitecore as well. Projects that are hard for developers to work on are generally not things that are successful for the client in those projects. And the kind of pain that those things can cause tends to reflect back on Sitecore. Yeah, pretty certain we've all seen the odd client who loudly shouts, "Sitecore sucks," in every meeting you're in, where what they really mean is, I work with an implementation that sucks. But that kind of nuance tends to get lost when it comes to the next procurement cycle. In the kind of the early years that I worked in this space, Sitecore didn't really do much advice on how projects and solutions should be built. Yeah, you did some certification where they taught you a bit about the development stuff, and some of that wasn't great advice, to be honest. They were still talking about things like put all the content fields on your page item, or hey, just stick the Visual Studio solution in the inetpub folder because that's developer experience. And we've definitely moved away from those sorts of patterns over the years. But even when they were giving out that sort of advice, it wasn't really officially documented anywhere. And that was seen as a market weakness by people like Gartner and Forrester and so on. And that was kind of the driver behind the appearance of Helix. There was good intention there, but I think a few years down the line, a fair number of people think it didn't quite pan out as well as it could have done. There was a certain amount of miscommunication and misunderstanding, particularly around what the Habitat example project was actually supposed to be telling you. And maybe kind of in parallel to that, the fashions of software architecture change as well. It's pretty easy to find people on YouTube saying, clean code is terrible these days, but that is a whole other presentation that maybe I'll do another time. I think possibly the less obvious downside of that lack of standards and understanding was in support cost. If you're a partner or a client and you get a license from Sitecore, you've got the right to call on them for a certain amount of support time if stuff goes wrong, basically. And unsurprisingly, those dodgy implementations that we don't like working with also seem to generate quite a lot of support tickets. And those can be quite expensive to manage. There's a not insignificant cost to maintaining the manpower and the infrastructure for them to have people sitting there trying to fix these problems for us. So, to summarize all of that, basically the driving force here is Sitecore wants us to build better projects. Fewer complaints, less money spent on support. The rising tide lifts all ships. If we build better stuff, people will think better of them. And there's another thing to call out here really is that development with Sitecore has moved on as well. Helix was all about back-end development. that was put together at a point where 95% of the code in your project was probably Razor and .NET and so on. But that isn't true for most XM Cloud projects. And you can build a .NET Core front end. Not a lot of people seem to be doing it. So the majority of this stuff is JavaScript based these days. And similarly, as we move towards proper SaaS deployment of the solutions, Sitecore wants us to move away from customizing the content management side of their product, because eventually that will be a sealed box that we can't actually fiddle with. So we're not writing back-end code there anymore either. Next.js has its own approaches to what project structure and patterns should look like, and they don't fit with anything that was said by the Helix patterns, really. So there's a gap for Accelerate to try and fill there as well, to try and communicate those standards around modern headless development. But, I mean, that's not to say that we'll never touch the kind of clean code stuff again. If you're writing API services that are going to sit in a headless solution, it probably is still relevant. So yeah, don't discount it completely, but it's not the main focus at the moment. So that's kind of broadly a bit of the theory of all of this stuff. But there's kind of a big chunk of work here. It's not something that Sitecore can just launch all in one go. So what have we got right now? Well, what they have launched is, I guess you could say, the first pass at the basic documentation. Rich Seal, if you've met him from the PTA teams, has been running some internal work on their side to kind of collect the ideas and try to curate the information they've got into some meaningful structure. They've been doing this internally for a while, it seems. And they've started drip feeding this stuff out to us now. And kind of the first version of this is on the documentation site now. That's at developers.sitecore.com under learn/accelerate/xmcloud, or at the QR code here. And currently they've got the beginnings of the kind of three key sections of content here for the stuff they're talking about documenting. They've got a chunk about pre-development, which is going to cover stuff like the planning work, the discovery, how you might structure source control, how to go about kind of planning your component design in a headless world, stuff around security, information architecture, and the kind of general sprint zero bits and pieces that we tend to think about before we commit to actually writing anything. There's a chunk for implementation, which unsurprisingly covers the tasks for the sort of making it phase, how to build components, troubleshooting your development environments, working with things like wildcards in headless, dealing with custom data and things that don't live in the CMS, and I think there's going to be a chunk about search as well. Kind of the meat and potatoes of day-to-day development stuff. And then there's a bit of appendixy stuff there at the moment as well, with some glossary around the terms for headless and some example code for here's how some of the components might get built and stuff like that. It's clearly focused on XM Cloud and Next.js at the moment. That seems like the best target for the first slice of these things because it's the place where the biggest change is going on, basically. So most bang for their buck to start with that bit. They've tried to write out most of this content in a kind of problem solution kind of documentation style. And it probably doesn't show up very well on the screen. I should have zoomed this before I screen capped it. But a broad example page looks vaguely like this. They'll summarize a scenario that you might find yourself dealing with, and they'll go through some suggestions about how to approach it. Some of that is black and white, this is what you should do, and some of it is a bit fuzzier, guidance on how the requirements might help you choose what patterns are appropriate. But I think if you take the time to click through what is there now, one of the things you will realise is that it's not a huge part of documentation at this point. They have definitely not finished right now. And I think it's important to point out that this is very much a first slice. If you were talking in more project management terms, it's a walking skeleton for what they plan to do. They're getting their process in place, they're getting their style for writing things up sorted out, they're getting their reviewing processes working. So what we're likely to see in the future is a load more stuff, basically. We're drip feeding things out at the moment, but they do plan to flesh all this out. Some of that is going to be more around the XM Cloud bits and pieces that I've mentioned, but I think we will also see this filling out in some of the other composable products as well, and how to deal with order cloud projects and how to deal with search projects and things like that, to try and have an overview for the whole kind of landscape of Sitecore's tooling and how it can fit together. It is worth pointing out that they are actually looking for advice and corrections here if people have things they want to submit. There is a want to contribute link on the bottom of these pages where you can get in touch with them if you've got stuff that you think isn't right, or suggestions for other bits and pieces that you think they should focus on. But I think the big thing that hasn't really been talked about properly at the moment is the whole audit side of this. There has been some talk that they're going to be checking up on us following these rules, but at this point I haven't seen any detail about that process in public, so this bit is a bit more opinion-y and you may wish to take it slightly with a pinch of salt, but I think this is probably going to follow a similar model to what they've been doing with their kind of health check stuff up until now. They currently have a service where clients can say to them, can you come and look at my project and tell me what you think of it, please? The obvious difference is that there's going to be a new set of standards here. They've got different patterns that they want everybody to be following in the new world. But there's probably two main reasons why we're going to see them rocking up to do these audits. The obvious one is because the license owner has asked for it. That tended to be why these things happened in the past. When a client pays hundreds of thousands for a web project, they want to know they got something decent. Effectively, they're looking for a second opinion. Sometimes that's just because you've got to the end of a project and they just want reassurance that you haven't done something crazy. Sometimes that might be because there's been a merger or an acquisition and the new management want a better understanding of what it is they've just bought. But then the other reason for this is probably going to be more important to a lot of us as agency developers or contractors, and that's Sitecore trying to gauge our quality. With the move towards composable, we're not doing the old style XP projects anymore. We've got a lot of change to do for our working practices. So Sitecore need to verify that their partner program's keeping up with this, basically. They want the specialization badges that, that we win when we have, when we do projects to be meaningful, basically. So we'll probably see these things happening because Sitecore's validating their partner program. It won't just be you need so many developers to have passed the exam and you need to have sold licenses or something to get the tick in the box for the badges in the future. I hope this is going to be a positive thing for the partner space, and improve the ecosystem broadly, and hopefully that kind of makes Accelerate as a concept good for us as developers as well. So, summary, because I realise I'm going over a bit here. This is a change of direction for Sitecore's documentation standards. They are moving away from pure code architecture to trying to be a bit bigger picture, but the goal is just to raise quality, to get people delivering better stuff. we don't have the full set of things now. If you happen to be following Jason Sancerre on social media, he's been doing a thing where he's kind of dropping links to things as they get published, and just to highlight some of the things that are there already, which is a good way of finding out what it is they're doing right now. But they are still working on it. Maybe there's an argument they'll kind of never finish because all this stuff is going to keep evolving, but I think we've got a while to wait until the bulk of this is filled out. And hopefully this is going to work better than the previous approach and actually will have the benefit of this quality improvement that they're aiming for. And I'm quite hopeful that they get enough of it out before I have to start on an XM Cloud project. I've got a good footing for that work. So that covers what I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention. And if anyone wants to throw questions at me, I will like my way through them.
So you say at the moment it's mainly XM Cloud focused, so they haven't looked at all that. Is there any documentation for other platforms like in the past?
So I think at this point the development teams that own the other products have their own approaches. I haven't had much involvement with the search side of things or the personalized side of things, but I have seen people talking about the team behind Order Cloud having quite they have a strong vision of what a good Order Cloud project looks like. I think there'll be a certain amount of bringing these things together and getting that stuff documented.
Because I can imagine that would be really useful to not just understanding how. Because for a lot of us, we've been working with Sitecore for a long time, so we've got in our mind what's a good Sitecore project, and we can still learn from this, but haven't used personalizer at all. So like, if I'm going to pick that up, well, actually that's really important to know, like what are the do's and don'ts, and also how it integrates in with a Sitecore project.
There is a chunk of documentation for all these things that exists in the Sitecore's main developer website at the moment, but it's more the traditional. Here's the buttons you need to click to set up a certain thing, rather than the patterns and process documentation that I hope we will have in the future.
Yeah, hopefully that would be useful. Interesting.
Yeah, I've seen Jason's kind of almost not daily, but a couple of times a week at least, 2, 3, 4 times a week, and I quite like the approach actually, because it feels like it's kind of an organic process, and he's releasing, or the team are releasing stuff as and when, rather than just waiting for months and then releasing it.
There's a massive dump of stuff, and
it feels kind of being more community led and
it's a bit more digestible when you get to look at it in chunks.
Yeah, it's I've not spent any great time looking at the moment, but I know Robert Hock was looking at like was it bring your own component for XM Cloud
That's
this week?
Part of the pages UI.
Yeah, so you can then create your own, make your own components available in Component Builder, and I've not looked at it really, but just that kind of drip feed of documentation as and when feel like a nice way to do it, rather than just nothing and then thousands of words of documentation all at once. It seems a more modern approach and a more collaborative approach to documentation.
From the PDFs of Sitecore 6.
You were saying this is like obviously very much focused on XM Cloud and Next.js for now. Is there a reference implementation or something that's going to cross-reference like the documentation against his? Is a real-world example for it?
They have the demo team at Sitecore have done a chunk of work on what I guess you might call a reference implementation for they've been trying to have one deployable solution that covers most of their technology stuff. I'm not sure whether you can literally download that at this point, but if you've come across their demo portal, I think you can spin it up. You can spin up some of their examples there. There are some other things that have been. There's a starter kit, I think, effectively GitHub repo for the vanilla XM Cloud source tree, which is basically it's the do nothing, but you can deploy it thing basically for starting an xMCloud implementation, which is basically, I think it's the thing that they clone from when you go through the wizard to set up a new instance, and you say, use this source control thing. They'll clone their example repository, and that's got all the kind of the developer Docker setup files, and it's got the kind of the basic JSS or SXA headless, or whatever we're calling it at this moment in time, stuff for the out-of-the-box SXA components. So I think the idea is that you then go on and add all your stuff to that, but it's just that kind of developer setup thing, basically.
Yeah, so not cross-reference at the moment, it's more.
Yeah, I assume these things will come together in more, but those I think those bits have been around for a while, and they need to kind of get brought into this as appropriate.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I shall sit down now.
Thank you very much.
I've got my notes here, and we can get this craft out. So yes, my talk today is on from JSS to Headless SXA. The idea of today's talk is to serve as an introduction to SXA for those who haven't used it, and how it now fits in with sort of the modern JSS headless architecture that we have within Sitecore. For those who don't know me, my name is Alex Washtell. I'm a freelance Sitecore consultant, Sitecore technology and ambassador MVP since 2017. I'm Kasaku on Sitecore Slack if you need to message me. So we're going to have a quick little history recap on JSS and SXA for those who don't know too much about them. So JSS enables Sitecore as a headless CMS. It was introduced in Sitecore 9. Originally, it was a server component originally known as Sitecore JavaScript Services. It's now known as Sitecore Headless Services. The reason being because we also now support ASP Netcore as a headless client. Versions of it have been tightly coupled to Sitecore versions, so effectively if you're on a particular version of Sitecore, if you're on Sitecore 9.1, you have to use a particular version of JSS. So for some degrees it's not been particularly great. If you wanted to upgrade to later versions of JSS, you usually have to upgrade Sitecore alongside it. It's very well supported. It's effectively, I guess I'd say it's seen as like a core tenet of Sitecore now. It's not going away. It started off and people thought maybe this is just going to be a new flavour of the month and we do like headless to appease some front end developers. But it's really a core part of Sitecore now. It's not just a small bit. It's very well supported with first class support for Next.js, which is one of the biggest React Node implementations that's out there on the web today. And then alongside that, we also have SXA. So SXA, the Sitecore Experience Accelerator, is essentially, that's exactly what it is. It's meant to accelerate website development. It was originally a third-party creation by an agency, but then got brought into Sitecore in 8.3. Again, versions have been also tightly coupled to Sitecore, much similar to JSS. Though that's I put at least now because that's starting to wane, so it's not quite as tightly coupled as it used to be. Began with support for MVC sites originally. Did previously have some support for headless with what's called JSON renderings, but it's now, as I'm going to show you, has a full support for headless. And what do I mean by accelerating website development? The idea is it provides you with common features and components to save reinventing the wheel. How this actually got created is the idea that agencies, particularly the agency that created SXA, they could onboard clients and try to sell them very cheap, quick setup of Sitecore, as in we can knock you out a website very quickly. It's not going to be 6 months. We can take mere weeks to build you a development. And often this was coupled in with single Sitecore installations that were supporting multi-tenant solutions, such as many clients sitting on a single Sitecore installation that the partner would run because they were operating small sites. And so it's a lot of components that you could reuse, that you don't have to rewrite again, such as grid components for the layout of your site, Google Maps, titles, navigation, all things that often people are having to write every time. They built these as components that you could just sort of drag and drop onto your site. And effectively, they try to achieve the dream, or at least the dream they'd sell, of a no-code approach to building a website, as in, enough. But some people want that. So basically, we say, we can build your site, it will require no bespoke development. We can just use SXA, and all we have to do is a bit of styling, and you've got a website. Typically smaller, simpler and smaller websites. Out of interest, just so I know for the rest of the talk, has anyone worked with SXA? We've got Adam here, who's built a site on SXA, so this will be interesting.
Jeremy's never used SXA.
Well, there you go.
I think there's, to some extent, there are a reasonable number of partners who didn't buy into it because you had to pay a license for this, and that was taking away your development money where you made a profit, basically.
Yes,
So
makes sense.
it was an additional
didn't
license
like
on
the
top, and yes, you then weren't, because, and it was also sold in such a way that we've got SXA, so all of this comes out of the box, right? And it's like, that's not also quite true to a large extent. But that was JSS and SXA. Today we have Headless SXA. So it's actually like a coin term, Headless SXA, and what does that actually mean? So Sitecore 10.3 and XM Cloud now have improved support for Headless, known as SXA. So what do we mean by that? Because it's not really a new product. It effectively just means they've got better support for previous SXA features for JSS. So previously they had a small amount of offering. Essentially we had people who had SXA, people started then building sites on JSS, and they said, well, I'm used to SXA, and they go, okay, we need to give a way to combine the two, really. So that's what this is. And actually, before I get onto this next point, I should say that in XM Cloud, at least, not so much 10.3, with XM Cloud, that already comes with SXA and the license, etc. So if you've got XM Cloud, you have SXA. It is expected, from Sitecore, it's stated, if you are building a headless site using XM Cloud, you will use Headless SXA. That is considered the default approach, and not just recommended, is they will demonstrate that to clients. So if you start building headless sites in XM Cloud without using this, you won't be delivering features they've effectively sold and told clients that they will be getting. So it's expected that you use Headless SXA. And I'll get on to this, not necessarily a bad thing, it's because you get a lot out of it, but I'm just saying that is effectively the default approach and what's expected of you. So I will say on this next point, so it's for Headless. Headless does also have support ASP.NET Core, but Headless SXA, currently this additional support is only for JavaScript Next.js, basically, the golden boy. So ASP.NET Core doesn't currently have any support for Headless SXA. Hands up if you're using ASP.NET Core rendering host. I'm going to guess there's no hands.
I don't think anyone is.
I've experimented with it, but
You say you don't know what it is?
No, I don't think anyone is.
No.
Does that statement means they haven't built the UI controls of .NET that you get out of the box?
Effectively, yes. Basically, this is maybe to answer your question. Any headless client can make use of Headless SXA because there's various parts to it, but what you're getting with Next.js and Headless SXA is effectively here's a solution ready to go that has the components, a bunch of components and middleware and a bunch of other things all done for you. You won't get any of that. So there's nothing to stop it. There's no technical reason why they can't do it, and they have effectively said, we will support this if people want it, or we may support it in the future. Effectively, you're not getting it now, and there's no reason to. So you can go make it yourself a name for yourself out there and go say, I've delivered, I've created the scaffolding, everything for ASP.NET Core, Headless SXA, but it's not there today. So the Sitecore website itself literally states that other implementations may come, and that doesn't just mean ASP.NET Core. It means, if you're on Nuxt or another flavour that's not Next.js, they could look at supporting it. I think they're effectively saying when people ask, if there's enough demand, we will do it. If not, you go do it effectively. So yeah, that's it. So you'll be missing out on the pre-written components and middleware. So before I get too much into what you actually get, I was a bit sceptical of Headless SXA at first, because as someone who's previously worked with SXA and seen a lot of sort of like the sales around it and what was pushed, to me, a lot of the push from it previously with SXA and MVC, the main push seemed to be here's all the components that you get, you get all these drag and drop components. You don't need to build Google Maps. You don't need to build one of these like 30, 40 components out of the box. You just need to do a bit of styling, and there you go. That didn't seem to me to gel so well with the idea of headless, given that headless implementations are meant to focus on using your CMS to get data out and giving you complete freedom over your front-end implementation. So allowing you to really say, actually, we're not controlling how you build it how you you're just getting the data out. Whereas this is then going back to saying, but also here's how you should build it. Here's a load of front-end components that are quite opinionated, whereas headless is really steering you away from the implementation of how you use your data. That said, after looking at it further and what I'll show today, there are benefits from it, but there's it's pros and cons of coming to use it. So we'll take a look at them, and you can form your own opinion on whether it's worth it. So what do you get? So Next.js with SXA, you effectively get a starter front-end solution with bundled SXA components and middleware. This is something that Jeremy mentioned at the very end of his talk as well. When you pull down the solution, it's basically a lot of agencies. It's similar to what a lot of agencies do in terms of they will build out, after time they build out their own starter solutions. It's like a starter kit, but one that you are intended to start using and then build your own solution on top. So you can get this, you'll get a solution, a Next.js solution ready to go with a bunch of components all in there set up, some middleware, and then you could start building your own components on top of that. And it is literally meant as it's not an example of implementation, it's take this solution, add your own code on top. So it's not a habitat, it's a boilerplate project for you to then build up on top of. So it kickstarts your build with a whole bunch of things out of the box. This is also not just Headless SXA, but this is the recommended approach by Sitecore. If you're building Next.js and you want to do Headless SXA, they say you should build on top of the solution. This one's not a mandate, it's just saying we recommend you build on top of this. I will say, however, it is quite opinionated. So some decisions are made up front. For example, this is built on using Bootstrap. It's built on how it decides to bundle the SCSS. So if your developers, particularly your front-end developers, have got we don't use Bootstrap, we use X, or we want to use CSS in JSS, or one of the many in JS rather, in one of the many implementations of ways of doing styling, this is going to make some decisions for you and say this is how you're doing it, which might not jive particularly well with what your developers are wanting to do. So that's something you have to think about. And like I said, you don't need this. And though Headless SXA is pushed as a default approach, it's not. So they're saying you should use Headless SXA, but they don't say that you also should use our layouts or our grid components. We're saying that's here, but if you want to actually just take this and rip out that, or just as in you can choose which bits you want to use. If you don't want to use our grid styling, that's not going to be a problem with them. It's with Sitecore rather. It's more the tying in with actually what you get in the back end from Headless SXA that they're actually mostly concerned about. So if you don't want to use any of the layouts, then you're not going to really cause yourself a problem. Well, to an extent, at least not getting in trouble with Sitecore. You can still make use of SXA features while rolling your own front end from scratch. But obviously you expect to be doing more work. This gives you a whole bunch out of the box. If you look like I said, the grid and stuff's already there. If you're going to start rolling out your own, you're going to have to rebuild a bunch of components from the start. And even if you're not using any of their components, like this is still a good starting point. There's some middleware and things for handling redirects and things that I'll touch on in a little bit. That is all really useful stuff. So if you don't like any of the styling, any of the layout stuff they've imposed on you, it's still a good starting point. I'd take it and start pulling bits out that you don't want to use. Just a final wrap on this, the current version of this as of today, well, as of August the 15th, but I checked on the way up and it's still tied to the Next.js 13.4, which isn't the latest and greatest, but it's actually not too old. So it was a couple of months behind when I last did this presentation. It's now about 4 months or so behind, but it's not a year or 2 years behind, which more used to with Sitecore. So I think they're actually updating this a bit more often than we're used to. That said, it still uses, if you know about Next.js, you may know there's a large migration from a pages folder approach to an app folder, the app router approach. And pages router is like the way that Next.js used to work, and they're really pushing the app router approach, and that's sort of feature of the platform. But Sitecore currently uses the pages approach. There is work being done actually internally within Sitecore about how they could move over to the app router. It's effectively not been done officially by the team. I can't remember the name of the developer, but they started looking into it with a eye to see work out how it could be migrated over to using it. So there's appetite to move over to it. Includes a whole bunch of useful scripts and scaffolding code. So again, outside of the components, there's useful scripts in there for if you are creating a new component, and it's got useful scripts to add, like to build out the factory classes for you to make sure that your new component ties into the layout service, so that when you contact the layout service, it says to use this rendering, it matches up to your React rendering. We've got nice code in there for doing that sort of stuff for you. So you'd really there's a lot of stuff in there that you'd be doing yourself a disservice if you didn't at least make use of, because you'd be having to rewrite it yourself anyway. And there's some really cool stuff in there. If you're not too familiar with Next.js, Next.js has a quite page approach, structured approach to code. So Next.js allows you to do server-side building of pages and client-side building of pages. One of the downsides to Next.js that doesn't really jive with our Sitecore approach is that you can do server-side building of pages, but you have to do it at the page level. So if you think, I'm going to have a component on this page and it's going to need to reference, we've got a product page, and we're going to call off to our product database and get some information about the product, because we've got components on this page that are going to show this product. At Next.js, you really have to build that at a sort of a page level. Like on this page, I know I'm going to need to feature a product, so I will go get that so components can feature this product. That doesn't really fit in with our Sitecore approach, where we try to build components, we try to think of it in a modular approach. If I need a product, it's because I've added a product module or product component to a page, and by featuring that component on any page, that's when I'm going to need the product data. So typically you can't do that in Next.js, you'd have to result on client-side binding. So when the browser loads and realizes it's a product, it can then make the API call. There's been some work done on with Sitecore Next.js to say, okay, we need to make this work so it's server-side, and they've worked out a way to do server-side data retrieval at component level. So you can effectively write code in Next.js that you couldn't do on a typical base Next.js site to say, actually, if this component features on this page, I need to go get this data at the server side. And that's really cool, and allows you to still build pages in a way, or build your site in a way that you would do with Sitecore. There is some downsides to that, and there is a bug raised by Corey Smith. You may know him because he's looked at this before, and he's raised a bug with Sitecore that there is bit of a mild security issue with it at the moment, to put it bluntly, but that will get looked at. It basically, how it builds the bundles accidentally does pull in too much, and that'll get sorted out, I'm sure. So it won't be a blocker to actually this working. They just need to get their tree shaking sorted out. Also, so you get a bunch of middleware. I'm going to mention a few of them more, but you also get things like personalize is already built into this. So if you're building on this with a view to also incorporating personalize, there's middleware that also already builds this in for swapping in and out components based on personalize, which is quite neat. So yeah, basically flexible. Yes, it's sure you can change what you like, but you deal with the upgrade consequences. So everything I've shown you here, this Headless SXA site, is basically it's an open source it's a repo on GitHub. So one of the useful things about this is in MVC world, we could have taken SXA and still changed the razor views, the CSHTML, like we could go edit them. It's much more open than that, because it's like you're getting a repo from your like a solution that's like already you can edit anything within it. So you can say, oh, that's a React component, I can change that how I see fit. So you could go in there and say, actually, I don't quite like how this promo components work, I'm going to change it. You are free to do that. But essentially, this is what Sitecore say, you will deal with the upgrade consequences. The idea is you should be able to pull down the repo and merge it in, so at later stages to get upgrades on these components. And if you go edit the components that they are providing you with, then you are going to have like merge issues and consequences. I'll touch on how you can kind of circumnavigate that in the future. So yes, you can change it, but you might cause yourself some headaches in the future, so you're sort of doing that on your own risk. How do you get started with this? So I mentioned there's 10.3 and XM Cloud. So essentially for 10.3 you can run this command. This is got npm installed. You can run npx create Sitecore JSS. That allows you to create a JSS site, and you'll have multiple templates you can choose from: React, Angular, or Next.js. For what we're talking about here today, you'd want the Next.js particular template, and then that also allows you to, that's a vanilla JSS, Next.js template, but you can have add-on templates, and one of the ones you would pick is Next.js SXA, and then that would start you off with this, this boilerplate Next.js site with SXA. This is an interactive thing, but you can be parameterized if you needed to script it for setups for people. If you want to find that out, you can do Sitecore JSS app initializer, or you can use this QR code, which I'm hoping is still valid because I created it quite a while ago, and I might need to go refresh it after today to make sure it still works at this QR shortcode. But if that doesn't work, Google this and you'll get there. XM Cloud is a little bit different. So there's a GitHub repository, XM Cloud Foundation Head. This is basically the full XM Cloud setup. This is what you use if you're looking as a developer to set up XM Cloud on your machine. So it's XM Cloud, not just Next.js, but it includes Headless SXA as part of it. And it's got so basically it's the Next.js, it's got the add-ons for Next.js SXA and Next.js multi-site. And this is Sitecore's recommend. If you're building with XM Cloud, this is their recommended approach. If this is how you build with XM Cloud, you should use this repository. It's maintained by the development team, and we'll get all the new features as they're released. If you do use this, it's interesting actually. So this particular repository, so this is all built on Docker. So I don't know if you've done XM Cloud development locally. One of the interesting things with this is that it always downloads the latest XM Cloud sort of image when you're running it locally, which is quite useful. It does mean you can spin up this and you've got a bit of a wait because you're spinning up and there's been a new release. The upside of that is you're always working with the latest XM Cloud release, because the idea is you're not just much like the deployed XM Cloud, you're not in control of the underlying sort of image. So if you use this locally, you'll get the latest XM Cloud. So this repo gets all the images, it just references latest basically, and that gets pushed to regularly. The documentation around this thing, I will say though, isn't fantastic. Bottom line is just go to this, if you look up at how do I install XM Cloud, the documentation's not great, just go to this repository, you basically clone it, and as long as you've got a license, you can do init and then up those two scripts and you'll have it running locally. That makes it a lot simpler than walking through the documentation of how I set up XM Cloud locally. I would just do that and you'll get it running. The front end between this one and the previous one are exactly the same, though they do come from two different repositories. I don't know how they manage it, but they seem to be two completely different repositories, but they push to them separately, but they are the same, because I checked 9 by 9 always, so it's to compare, am I getting the same in both of these? So that's also, if you're interested in getting XM Cloud, you can get it from there. So, a little bit on SXA. So I've talked about kind of what you're getting, but like, you know, what actually does an SXA site look like? So SXA is multi-tenant, like multi-site from the ground up at its core. Much for the reasons that I described earlier, it was designed to be built in such a way that you could have a Sitecore instance that was supporting multiple sites. So SXA allows you to create sites, and everything inside it is based on the fact that you may be running more than one site in mind. So this is a typical SXA site in all the images. Sorry, it's too small at the back there, but this is what you'll get. I'm just going to open all these up and talk through them. This is what you get from them. So basically you'll have your site template, but you get interesting things such as, though you have the whole media library inside Sitecore, you get sort of siloed media libraries and siloed dictionaries, because these are things that you can create. This is just media for this site. Other sites within this instance shouldn't have access to this. The same for the dictionary. So typically if you just use the standard Sitecore dictionary, that's site in like a whole instance wide, whereas this is built around, this is a dictionary for your site. Out of the box, finally you get this data folder structure, the idea being this, if this is, these are things, all these things I'll point to, you'll see, oh, these are things we probably built anyway, such as, for instance, when you build out content, you've probably built it in such a way that you can support, oh, we want to be able to have a banner that just sits within this page, so it sits underneath this page, but also, actually, we'd like to have a shared content folder area where we can have banners and we can put them there, and then any page can reference them. That's the idea, and that's what you get sort of out of the box of SXA. You get these areas for doing that already. And you get this whole area on presentation settings, which I'll touch on a little bit of what that gives you around the page designs and partial designs. And then you get a bunch of included components. With SXA MVC, it was in the 30, there was a lot of components. There's actually there's a much smaller subset that you get with Headless SXA, which is each of these, a few devoted to layout and some devoted to content. So this is just kind of give you an idea of what these sort of things are to achieve. So you have layout components related to a container, which is part of like your grid setup for making sure that you have things that sit in the page. You have column splitters for making sure that you can have columns across your page, and allows you to do all the definitions, such as, you know, I want this to be one column on mobile, I want it to be 2 columns on tablet, 4 columns on desktop. All of that's in there. And then you get content components out of the box, so you get things like a title for just displaying the current page title, images for rendering an image with an optional link and caption, rich text for rendering a rich text field from a data source, page content, which is very similar, but it renders the content rich text field from the current page, and a content block, which is actually a React component they add in there, which doesn't actually really serve its purpose apart from to show you here's how you build out your own React component. So it's like a sample implementation that comes with SXA Starter to say, if I copy that, that's how I could build like the most simplest of my own components. You get promos for combining an image, text, and link for a visual site navigation. So in that image that I just showed you previously, if you're wanting to navigate around the site, that's what promo's for. You get navigation. So essentially for building your top level navigation or any kind of navigation, so mobile menus or flat lists, effectively for things that are going to render out lists of links, but based on the hierarchical structure of your site. And then you also get a link list. So it's effectively something that will point out a list of links from a data source. So something if you're going to feature on your page to say, here's some PDFs, also here's some things that we want to link to. That's what the link list is for. So I'm just like pointing, these are the sort of things. So this is like, I've already out of the box got something for referencing, showing the title of the page and the navigation. And this is also showing sort of the SXA out of the box styling that you get. So there's some like styling, obviously, which you can change, but it does have something out of the box, so it doesn't look absolutely awful. But what if the bundle components aren't enough? So Sitecore provides, so effectively, they're not expecting you to just use these to entirely build your site. Obviously, you're going to need to extend these. So what they provide is a component extension flowchart. Don't squint your eyes to read this, I'll share a link to it. And it's effectively, this is your question of like saying, what's my approach? I need to add a new component, and these are the questions that you can answer yourself to decide on what's the approach, because for every time you need to add a new component, there are a bunch of questions and different outcomes. So is it a custom style that you're needing to add? Are you needing to take an existing component, but on a particular page you want it to appear slightly differently, but all the data underlying is the same? Is it a variant where you're actually wanting to use a new React component but use all of the same Sitecore templates? So you want to use all the same templates as before, the data's the same, but you need to radically change its output in a way that styling won't just work. You actually want to use a new React component. That's what variants are for. They support cloning components, which is effectively like a copy and paste to a new component, but it copies. If I say I want to clone the promo and call it promo 2, it'll create me promo 2, but it also clones all of the templates related to it to create you an entirely new separate component that is unrelated to the first one, but as a copy of it as a base for you to start. And then there's the new component, like there's none of these steps work. This is where you would look at your own custom component or rendering. So there's a link to the flow chart of the advice on how to follow that. And that's this. This is the components, but SXA is much more than just these like front end components. And I think that's actually what was sold. I think the back in the original days of SXA, it was all really heavily pushed on. Here's the out of the box thing, the look and feel, the components you get on the site. I actually think that's probably the least valuable part of it. Some of those parts are useful, but would I really be needing many of those on the site? Is it that difficult to knock up a component that displays a title field? No, I think that's all quite simple. But there's a whole bunch of things that you're going to get which actually are very useful to you and are the things that saves you writing them again and again. Here's just a quick preview, but I'm going to just step through them to show. So these are valuable, even if you completely dismiss bundled components and saying I don't need that title field. These are the things that I think you want to look at that are worth giving up. Redirects. So these are managed by users in content editor. We've all had to implement redirects in every site. A lot of us have probably used modules over the time that have offered it. It's just something that comes now out of the box. So these are managed by users in content editor, and with Next.js, the middleware is already there. So just by pulling out, for instance, if you start off with this SXA starter, you'll have a folder called redirects, and you could go, I want to create a new redirect and give it an old path and a new path, and it will already be handled. So the Next.js site has middleware that when a request is made, without getting too much into detail, it uses GraphQL, it grabs all the redirects, and then it sort of stores that in memory, so when requests come in, you can go, oh, that's a redirect, I'll send them off. Again, small thing, but it's something that a lot of us have had to build. Sitemap, so there's a Next.js API endpoint that queries Sitecore to build a sitemap of pages out of the box for you. Pages and partials, so page and partial designs. This is a really big part of SXA, and it's something that I've seen it in custom implementations where people have created this from scratch. This is the idea. It's an idea for you to be able to have this reusable layouts for design consistency. For instance, you may have the idea of every article page we have always has to have the header and like a setup in just the exact same kind of way, but we do want to have the freedom adding additional components. So we're not talking about complete control of every component on the page, but you want to be able to at least say it has to have these ones, or you want to create the header once and make sure that every page has got a header, but still have the freedom to change what's in that header. And this is what pages and partials are about. So partials, for instance, what it effectively boils down to is I can create a partial with the header partial, and then I can say, in this placeholder, we're going to have this header component. And then all these pages can use that partial, and then if I go edit that partial, it changes on every page without having to go update all those individual pages or worry about like shared layouts and things. It's in one single location. And allows me to change it once, and it affects on all of these kind of pages, or add additional things into those placeholders. And that's a lot of what you get with SXA, is has this idea of pages and partials. It's quite sophisticated. It can all tie up to particular templates. You can say certain templates have different pages. a page being just a collection of partials. You say a page and it's got these partials on it. Cross-site sharing, so I've mentioned that it's all about the multi-tenant solution, and they also then facilitate the fact if you want to create content that can be shared across multiple sites. Content tagging, so being able to create tags and tag things to pages. This is one thing that the MVC version of it came with a lot of components for this, such as if you wanted to have articles that featured a tag cloud or rendered the tags that were attached to pages so you could go to them into a category page. Currently, you don't get any of that with Headless SXA. They've got all the tagging facility, and then they show you how you can effectively use GraphQL to go pull that data down. I won't be surprised if in the future they do then release those as also components, because it's such a big, it was kind of quite a big focus on the SXA that they have those in there. So I imagine in a future version they would put those in. You get advanced caching. So again, this is similar to how I mentioned, like we have dictionary and the media at site level. If you've worked with caching before, usually caching is set on the renderings, but you can still do that. But then within Sitecore, you can now actually say if you need to, well, I want to apply a set caching level at for this particular site. This rendering will cache at this level, but for a different site it won't. So you can specify the caching at a site level. You can also support donut caching. So this is where if you want to say, I want to cache this whole header, but then there's got an inner rendering in it that I don't want to cache. That's what donut caching is, which can be really useful. So you're not having to over cache things, such as for example, if you've got a header that you've got like on my account thing, which if you're logged in will show you your login name. You don't want to actually have a situation where different users are seeing the same cached header with their names, believe it or not, I've seen that happen. And donut caching will be able to punch a hole in it basically and say cache all of this except that placeholder, and then allow that to not be cached. Navigation filters, so again, these similar to what you've probably implemented before. So you might have had things like we've had to build a breadcrumb, but for some reason marketers don't want a particular page to appear in the breadcrumb, so we want it to be skipped over, like it's a folder, it's not an item that we want to show. That's what navigation filters are for, so you can mark items so they don't appear in navigation. Error pages, you get sort of 404 and 500 support, that's already just out of the box, support for those. Advanced data sources, so you get tokens that you can use, especially because we've got this site-specific folders, so you can use tokens to refer to folders within your own site, rather than sort of absolute references, which is useful. And custom styles, so for adding additional styles to components that editors can easily toggle on and off. It's a bit like rendering parameters. So rather than having to completely change a component, you can just have if I want to toggle left or right aligned text, you can do that. So it's similar to what we would have done for rendering parameters. Just coming up to the end here, so the last things I'd recommend, I suggest, is some documentation that is very useful. One of these is the XM Cloud recommended practices, which I've referred to once or twice. This isn't SXA specific, but it's something that I think if you're looking at XM Cloud development, it's well worth looking at, because this is sort of a statement from Sitecore on these what you should do. So when I've mentioned things such as that repository, that you should use, or they recommend you using, but this is where they make that recommendation. And then alongside that, there's also Sitecore SXA best practices. And again, this is from Sitecore, and this is what they're saying, these are the things that you should use. So where I've called out various things that Sitecore say you should do, that's referenced in this documentation, and this will cover things such as that component flow chart as well, if that's what you're going to look at. And that's it. That's a whirlwind tour of Headless SXA. Any questions?
Jeremy's got some.
Yeah, I can see Jeremy's like,
So in the real world, how big a problem is this? You have to merge in the changes from Sitecore's repo when you upgrade things.
Well, this is all theoretical, Jeremy, so I don't know about the real world actually. So in this case, I haven't used Headless SXA yet. I've worked with SXA in the past.
Yeah.
I've looked at the Headless implementation, and I've looked at the chat on Slack and the various recommendations coming from Sitecore, and they've effectively said you can edit it, and they do just say you will have to deal with those changes. I've looked at it and I think for instance, I can't see those components changing massively. Like they're not going to suddenly push out as we've completely changed how that component functions. So I feel like if you know what you're doing and you realise we need to change this for a reason, like when these components come in, you could make it's not going to be too.
So you mentioned the thing about Corian is bugging the way it deals with component level data on the server. If the fix to that changes how you declare components, that sounds like
I see what you mean.
Merge project.
Yes, possibly. I mean that would be quite a fundamental change.
Yeah,
I guess.
I'm making that up.
Yeah, no, I see. Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, I mentioned the merge changes in a way that we've all dealt with Sitecore upgrades, and it's kind of in the same question of saying how big a problem is a Sitecore upgrade to my code that I've built, and it's similar, I think.
I guess perhaps my problem with understanding this is that I'm not a front-end developer, not really experienced in the kind of TypeScripts and stuff.
Yeah.
I'm used to the idea that if Sitecore make a breaking change in an XP solution, you probably get a load of compiler errors about it.
Yeah.
Is that likely to be the same thing here?
Yeah, it should be because you're building it on TypeScript. So like that, I would expect. So there is some it's you would if you're using parts of the API that have now disappeared, for instance, you'll now get that change. So things are better in that regard rather than things going wrong. Maybe there's subtler changes, but I think though we are used to compiler errors, and when we've done upgrades, we're also used to things suddenly not necessarily not breaking the compile, but just don't work the way they used to. So I think it is a similar one. I think the thing I know exactly what you mean, but it is getting better in that regard. I don't have a concrete example of how these things are really changing because even though these updates are pushing out, this is being largely static so far, and it's more warnings that they're putting out. And like you could have merge issues. It's user beware, but I haven't seen concrete examples of exactly like this as an instance where it has broken.
So is that like if you customized a TypeScript like React view basically, and then Sitecore roll out a change to that component, and then you'd have to merge that?
Yeah, I mean, I think they don't say, for instance, they will say, for instance, you shouldn't change our components. Like if you like the promo, clone it, make your own component based off it, because if you can change it, you're more likely to hit issues. So if it's like you're better off just similar to before. In the same way with SXA, we could have gone in and changed the razor views and gone, I'm just going to change it. There was don't do that. Clone it, and so this is the same sort of story as it is clone and edit. What I do find more interesting, and I'd like to see, this is where, because it's all early days, and I'd like to see how real world implementations have gone, that I think is probably the biggest sticking point is that the setup, the site that you get is opinionated. For instance, it uses Bootstrap, and having worked on quite a few solutions, not necessarily as doing the front end for it, but working the front end, quite a few installations don't use Bootstrap. People roll their own. So getting this and being told we're using Bootstrap, I imagine that will immediately hit with well, we don't use that, and now we've already immediately out of the box got to edit it. But I do, like I did say, they haven't pushed it as though you should be using the layout stuff. It's much more about you use the middleware, use SXA within Sitecore, build your Sitecore side of components to SXA. I think they're more concerned rather than the front end part of it.
Right.
I think so. The front end is more this is a good starting solution. If you effectively, they're saying like you could start this from scratch, but you're wasting time. We've given you all this like free stuff. If you want to go do it, then that's your own time. Basically, you're wasting is what they're saying. But I think it's when you start, what they are saying is if you're using XM Cloud, and this probably ties back to Accelerate, is that if someone goes, we've got this headless solution, and they come to open it up, and it's just base JSS, not using any of the stuff that I've just shown you inside Sitecore and all that setup, they'll be like, why have you not used that? And that's I imagine, will be the sort of thing that gets called out in Accelerate, as in, I mean, I know for a fact like is that XM Cloud equals headless SXA, don't not use it. That's it. That seems to be the polite thing. I don't know actually what it means if you don't use it, but that's what they've said.
Yeah, so I guess you're going to potentially bump up against an opinionated front end team that don't want to use Bootstrap and they want to use Foundation, or they want to roll their own grid system or whatever.
And to their credit, they haven't like don't know. I would have liked to see, it might be nice if they basically said, here's 2 versions of this repo, here's the really bare bones, it's just Next.js, it's just the middleware, like the useful redirects and stuff, so you don't have to write that, but there's no front-end opinionation, rather than a take this and delete things out. It would be nice to not have those, unless there's stuff that I'm missing. You can do the Next.js and add on Next.js multi-site and not SXA, but I think the SXA's got the things like the redirects and things. It's like the redirects and all those components, so I don't think you can just pull it in at the moment.
Am I right in understanding that Headless SXA is missing a bunch of components versus MVC XSA? Yeah.
So if you were to go on there's a chart on their site which are these are all the ones in MVC, which is this, and these are the ones that aren't. But to be honest, like so when I say there's things like tagging that's not in there. But I think actually a lot of it's not going to really, because I don't think I see where components are being the most useful thing. Because there's things like you get the Google Maps like out of the box thing, which might be more handy in MVC, but here I think people are going to build that bit ourselves. We don't want that as the implementation. I think it's not the component stuff is the big deal, to be honest.
I think that goes back to the thing from before about some agencies just kind of bounced off SXA. If you've got a heavily design focused website, there are definitely limitations about how close to the perfect design can you get with somebody's fixed markup from these components and just throwing CSS and script at it.
Especially early days of SXA and being tied to a certain version of jQuery, Bootstrap, and like the grid layout, like splitters and stuff. I know a lot of customers had a nightmare with.
It's definitely better. Like it worked pretty well. Like as in the out of the box, I was like I built a site to like test this all out, and it's quite nice. But it is making decisions for you, and even the fact that I like many devs I work with use like componentized SAS, so your styling sits next to your React components. This is already our assets sit here. These sit here. That's already an opinion that some people are like, that's not how we do things here. So given the front end world is very, very opinionated, all developers are very, very opinionated. It's making it's like it's there. But again, just to reiterate, that is not the bit that they're saying you. So they are front saying, you can change that if you want to. Like that's not what we're going to mark you for. And I hope that's the message they carry on with Accelerate.
I can't see them nailing us to Bootstrap.
It's
I hope, interesting because I don't think any front end people would recommend that at this point, would they?
Well, even SXA newer versions, you can swap it out for I think Foundation.
So
and other
it
grid
used to come with
layouts.
them, whereas that's what I looked for in this one, but it only comes with. I think if I remember actually, there is documentation on the site on how to change it. I think as in where you will need to go in and edit it, but it's not in such a way as you can easily change it. It's here's how you would go about changing it.
Okay.
How do you find obviously you've done a kind of POC demo. How do you find the developer experience compared to kind of say traditional XM? So you created a new component, for example, you have to create a new content type, map that, obviously old world, you'd have
it's been all right. I gave
kind of 2 places.
It's been quite a change. I did give it a go because I wanted to understand exactly. So if I create a new component, I'm sitting down, I'm going to create a new, I know there's the flow chart, but if I wanted to go from scratch to create a new component, how many steps are involved or what exactly involved? And it wasn't too bad. I won't go through the steps also, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's like it wasn't so bad, especially with the scaffolding they put in place. So it's largely it's similar in terms of you're going to be creating your template, you're going to be creating your rendering, though with SXA, a lot of SXA is all PowerShell driven. That's the reason why PowerShell exists inside Sitecore was to build SXA. But you run a dialogue to say create new rendering, and you give it your name, and it's going to go create. Here's the rendering of the item for it, and it sets up a bunch of stuff for you, so you can then go, okay, now I'm going to edit that data source template, and now I've got the name. Your next step is I'm going to go over to the code and then run a script that they provide to say I want to create a component called matching name, and it then creates the React files and things for you, and then make sure it matches up and stuff like that. So it's not so bad. There's some nice convention based stuff in there, such as if you just make sure your folder is called the same name as your component over there, it'll work. So that's quite handy.
That's a nightmare if you don't know, because you.
Yeah, so what they've actually done, so it's actually not so much script based, it's convention based, but you can see the script that it runs. So if you want to edit and change it, and so effectively there's a script that at startup scans the directory and goes, okay, layout service name matches to this, and all it's doing is it's spitting out a JavaScript file which you could edit, and it's just doing some things for you that I think a lot of people would have ended up writing, going, oh, every time we do this, we've got to go back this line. Let's write something that just sort of just matches it up for us. They go, well, that's it. It's already there. The
front-end equivalent of all the Helix generator stuff that
yes.
everybody ended up with in
yeah. So I was able to. I didn't think it was that bad. It was new, so it was a little bit slow because I had to get used to it because it's a bit different. And there's some. With the XM Cloud, what you get is you get the SXA starter site, but then there's also a Docker for it to effectively your what's called the rendering host. So in the real world, you're going to have your either XM Cloud or your CM server somewhere, and then you're going to have your rendering host, so your service that's running Node. And what you get out of the box is, you've got your Next.js site, but also here's the Docker instance, which will be your rendering host, and it's all set up in such a way that every time you make an edit and save, it pushes it up to the Docker components as changes. So I've got the rendering host running and CM server running, and I can make changes inside my code, and it's doing live refreshes. It's quite a bit slower than I'm used to, but you do see I can make styling changes and I can see them appear whilst I'm moving the
less
site.
use for you as a consultant compared to agency people who have more likelihood of being able to fire stuff up in the cloud. One of the things they are talking about more is that they want the development model to be you have a cloud instance of the CMS and all you run locally is Node and your text editor.
Yeah.
So you can develop against central shared content and not have to run all that Docker stuff. They've done, I think this is out now, the initial versions of the example GitHub repository were a mono repo of the Docker stuff and the head stuff. They have now split that apart, and the deployment process copes with the two separately. So you can now do a head only deployment and not have to worry about any of the container stuff, which is way faster.
Is that within a different repository then?
I think so.
Okay. Because I've largely used the XM Cloud, which is basically it's all there and all together. And though because it's much the same documentation. Like you can run XM Cloud locally, but it's all geared around assuming you will be using XM Cloud in the server anyway, and you'll just point. A lot of the documentation is about get the rendering host running and then just point it at the cloud version of it.
They fixed some of the rough edges around making pages and stuff work with local sites. So you can't run their fancy new world editor that replaces Experience Editor locally at all. That is a pure SaaS service. But they've come up with some clever trickery that means it can edit your local site even though it's Next.js on your local machine. It's Sitecore somewhere in the cloud, and it's the editor somewhere else in the cloud. The three all manage to sync up together. There's UI for it, I think, coming now as well.
Right.
That sounds brilliant when it goes smoothly, and terrible as soon as one small thing goes wrong.
Which I think is probably the argument against why front-end people don't want to run Docker, because it's exactly the same problem.
Yeah. So you've done traditional React, Next.js, non-Sitecore, a fair bit, right? Is that fair to say?
To some extent.
Very non-conventional. And so if you compare that to Headless SXA and the Next.js implementation there, what are you? I know this is kind of a demo thing, and you've not really done it in a sort of real world scenario, but what do you not like about it, or what have you seen that you're like, not sure about that?
Oh, I thought we were going to stop, and that's a really big open-ended difficult question. I don't know at this stage. It's really early to tell. It's just still players. They are not working against Next.js. They are working it's using the Next.js framework. They're not cramming Sitecore into it. It's built respecting how Next.js works. And even when I've talked about those extensions that they've built in, the server-side magic they're doing, it's done in a way that it uses the same sort of function structure that you get with Next.js, so it's sort of sympathetic and it should look as if you're used to Next.js.
Okay.
So yeah, it is still like, it's just the headless side of it, like that bit, is all just, it's largely just React. It's much the same as any other Next.js site. It's got a bunch of stuff in there, so there is a learning curve that's going to come with it. Because one of the downsides, I'd say, is other headless implementations that I've worked on, looking like React, working with headless CMSs, it's been much more we start with Next.js pure clean, and we will just write a simple API that just client that calls off to this API to go get us data, and then we're working up, like we will just build everything on top of that. Whereas this is more like, here's a boilerplate on top of it, which to me was immediately like, well, I'm now being handed some magic that I don't quite know how it works, and a lot of developers may be like, well, now I feel like a bit of power's been taken out of me, but it is doing all the heavy lifting you would be writing yourself, such as, let's say you go to a URL and you want that to go off to call out to the layout service, work out like what are the renderings that I need to display, and then turn those into React components. I've had to write that. I've been on a project where we had to write that ourselves, and it was we had to do it ourselves. Therefore, it was clear how to do it, but we still had to do it. Whereas this is kind of saying, well, don't write that yourselves. It's here for you. So there is the learning curve of knowing I've got to put this here, and it will map up to this bit from the layout service. And I don't really know what the layout service JSON looks like because I never see it at the moment. So you abstract that stuff's abstracted away for you, but maybe for the better, because I wouldn't want to have to write that from scratch each time. So that was similar with JSS. That's what you got with this. Isn't really SXA at that point. It's JSS was the same. It gave you libraries that just said just put this in, and it will sort of take over the operation of how your Next.js resolving of URLs to content works. So you will sort of lose that ability. You're not really losing it. You can go in and look at how that code works. It's just you then trust on that magic.
I suspect that's the here be dragons for the future with these projects. Is that we're gonna find ourselves crashing into stuff where people have customized that sort of thing. You know, the modern equivalent of I wrote a custom resolver in a pipeline that does some crazy magic. So some URLs go to a completely different place to the one you expect. And
I exactly imagine that it'll be very similar. No, it's a good analogy. We've all worked on things where we've had to do the customized resolves or things like that because this is how it's going to work. It'll be similar. It'll be similar to that.
So you would. So by what you're saying, then you wouldn't, if a React developer started a project, they wouldn't be like super surprised about how it's implemented and how it all works.
No, it's still Next.js. It's if they're a Next.js dev and say how I know how pages get built up. It's like, oh well, that gets sort of delegated. This is going to tell you how the page gets built up, but create your components here, and and so that is not that's all largely the same. And the way they've done the middleware, the redirects, is all using is how you would do it in Next.js. Next.js has a way of writing middleware, and they've done it the same way. They haven't just sort of injected in their own way of doing it. It just uses very clear Next.js middleware. So if you're used to that, you could also see how that works as well.
Right.
I guess it doesn't seem to have like a helixy structure from the very little I've seen of like isolating features. You can say, this is out of the box, these are my things on top. It seems to all be kind of mashed in together.
I will say specifically
mashed
on
might be a
Helix.
harsh word.
Well, no, but mashed, I mean, interestingly enough, the Helix thing, I will say that, and Sitecore are also clear about this, is Helix is for Sitecore and is for your ASP.NET side of things. It's not for your headless implementations. So none of this is like Helix. You won't see any feature or foundation, and they are very clear as in saying, don't do that in your headless side. Like, we've done it there, and they still recommend you do it when you're doing your what they call the platform solution, your changes to Sitecore. But here you will just see like it's probably back there somewhere. I lost the thing, but you will just see a components folder with a bunch of components within it. They don't there's nothing.
There's no telling which of those are out the box.
Somewhere. That is one thing. It doesn't differentiate it to say this is Sitecore. So I'm going through no, well, this stuff is where you get components and there's just a dump of stuff in there.
Yeah.
And this is what I did find a little bit off-putting, because to me, it's learning it. It's just like, it's like being given, you join a project and someone goes, here's a solution, and you go, and this is what you're starting with. And you're like, there's a whole bunch of code and files and library. What can I touch? What can't I touch?
Yeah.
And that's the bit I do think is a little bit difficult. What are you expected to go, these are the bits you can tweak, or these are bits, do not change that, otherwise it all breaks.
Yeah.
You'll see there's things like dictionary service factory stuff I didn't mention, but like it's got things built in for the dictionary, so that if you've now, it ties in with how Next.js localization works, so you can just basically have a function that just says translate, give it the key value that you'll use for the dictionary, and that's all in there. But it's just a class that's just at the top level. It's not tucked away in a library. Part of that, I think, is just due to how Next.js works. You can't just, for instance, in ASP.NET, we can say, well, our web config or our Sitecore config will point to this library and say, that's where the assembly sits for this pipeline. Here, I don't think you can do that quite so much with it. You're having to say, that's where the file lives.
I think
it's not in there.
Yeah.
I think Sitecore's position on this stuff at the moment is we are not going to try and write standards for headless development for using JSS, because those things should follow the patterns that the library creators that we're building on top of set.
Yeah.
So this is how Next.js structures a project. I'm sure if you go and create a site based on Vue or Angular or something, they have their own patterns.
Yeah.
And it's kind of logically from Sitecore, they don't want to get into that.
Makes sense, I guess. And like some people were trying to apply Helix principles to JSS, weren't they, back in the day? I saw some people trying to do it, and most front end people would push back on that.
We did a collection. It wasn't JSS; it was still MVC. But we did a collection of projects where the front end people tried to have that modular approach, and it can work. But I don't think it works on top of that.
No.
Basically,
Yeah.
you have to do that as your guiding principle for everything you're writing, which is fine if you're building a Vue front end on top of MVC and you control everything except the reference to the Vue library. But I don't think you can.
And maybe it's not a big deal. Maybe it's just you get used to it.
I mean,
Yes.
You know which ones are there already. You know which ones you don't need.
I think
they're all yours.
It really reminds me of, I've worked with various different agencies who have all had, and I'm sure if UNRVLD have the same, as in we have our boilerplate Sitecore project. If you start a new Sitecore project, this is your starting solution that's already got, our Sitecore extensions, our string extensions, like various whole things are already there because we ended up writing that for every project. And this is almost like that, as in like, we're always writing this, it's here. Yes, it's made a decision, but it's the same way that someone at some company said, when we build sites, it makes this decision. They're pushing it for you.
Is scale going to be the challenge here? When you do get projects that have a lot of UI components sometimes. Maybe SXA hides some of that behind some of its configuration behavior in the UI, and you have fewer but maybe slightly more complicated components, but you can end up with quite a lot. It's just one giant big folder.
Yes, yeah, and it's interesting because certainly stuff, because from the previous SXA site, I've only worked on one installation, and what's really pushed was those things like you've got the column splitter, and like you can do grid-based stuff. It actually turned out to really not be that good for us because we demonstrated all to the client and showed you the experience that you can add on columns, and they go, I just want to go add this component on. Or like the editors was like, oh, now I've got something design a page and I've got to add a grid on and I've got to put this in. And yes, I've got complete control, but now I'm having to do a lot more in the experience editor. And we felt like, oh yeah, it's great, we're not having to do as much coding. I'm having to spend more time in the experience editor, which to me wasn't my favorite place to be. And then, so yeah, you're having to, yes, you can do it, but should you be giving that much power to editors? But Eddie, you can take all that. You can say, actually, we don't want users to be able to say, yes, this can go into anywhere on the site. We say, no, you can only put it in this top level placeholder because it's going to look rubbish anywhere else. So just don't give them that option. Yes, yeah. I mean, that's it. And that was an interesting variant because that particular project, it was like a mix of, we had a briefly designed site, and now we've got to work out how to fit it into SXA. And old world SXA was more like, if you're going to build SXA, make it look like the components but slightly different. Don't try to marry up beautiful slides and say, this one doesn't push as much design stuff on you. It's more like, here's a bunch of useful stuff. And like I say, it's like you'll get in there and go, there's a lot of code here, I don't know what it's doing. And yeah, you kind of just, yeah, you can use it or not. Anything else before I sit down?
I won't ask any more.
Any questions?
Yeah, you say you just need the repo and a license. Will your normal partner license work, or do you need something extra?
Also, I mean, I know it's included with XM Cloud. I don't quite know. Is SXA still partner license gets you everything like that you need, but
Our partner license will work, yes.
I usually, whenever a license question appears, I like throw something in one direction and run out the other because I don't know the answer to this question. I know XM Cloud gets you everything because you've already got everything, but with 10.3, for instance, SXA, is that still an optional extra?
No, I think it all got rolled in at some point.
It used to be separate. So yeah, if you've got that license, you should be able to just pull it down and start. And even if you're not using XM Cloud, the XM Cloud, like with the intention of it, it is a really easy way to start playing with it locally. If you've got no intention of pushing it out there, just to use it locally is quite easy. That's what I did for this one.
Nice.
Yes.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alex.
Cool. Thank you very much.